The night Dorothy Turner lost her horse was the same night she found something far more valuable, though she would not understand that until much later, when Daniel Hale's rough hands were gentle against her face, and the Wyoming stars bore witness to a love neither of them had gone looking for. It was the autumn of 1878, and the Turner Ranch sat 20 miles outside of Laramie, Wyoming, a sprawling operation of 600 acres that Dorothy's father, Elias Turner, had carved out of raw frontier land with nothing but sheer determination, and the kind of stubbornness that made men either legends or graves. The ranch ran 300 head of cattle and a dozen horses, and it had been Dorothy's whole world since the moment she was born on that same land 23 years ago, delivered by her mother on a winter morning so cold that the water in the wash basin had frozen solid by the time the sun came up. Her mother, Clara Turner, had died of fever 7 years back when Dorothy was 16, leaving Elias a quieter and harder man, and leaving Dorothy with a household to manage, a grief too large for her chest, and a determination she had inherited from both parents equally. She was not soft. Nobody raised in Wyoming ranch country could afford to be soft. But there was something in Dorothy Turner that went beyond practical toughness, something warm and alive and stubborn about remaining that way, even when the land and the years tried to press it out of her. She was a handsome woman by anyone's measure, tall for her time with dark brown hair she usually wore in a practical braid that still managed to curl around her temples in the wind. Her eyes were the particular shade of amber that changed in different lights, going from gold in the sun to something closer to dark honey by firelight, and she had her father's strong jaw softened by her mother's full mouth. She worked as hard as any man on the property, could rope a calf, mend a fence line, read whether the way other people read books, and had once talked a spooked stallion down from a ledge above the creek bed with nothing but her voice and patience. The horse she was chasing that October night was named Copper, a 4-year-old roan gelding with a white blaze on his nose and a temperament that was generally cooperative but had a particular dislike for lightning. The storm had come in fast from the northwest, the way Wyoming storms often did, with almost no warning beyond a sudden change in the quality of the air and a drop in temperature that made your skin prickle. Dorothy had been down at the barn checking on one of the mares who was close to foaling when the first crack of lightning split the sky directly overhead, and Copper, who had apparently worked his way loose from the paddock latch she had been meaning to fix for 2 weeks, had bolted into the darkness beyond the tree line. She grabbed a lead rope and a lantern and went after him before she stopped to think about whether that was wise. Later, she would acknowledge it had not been wise at all. But Copper was her horse, given to her by her father on her 20th birthday, and the idea of him breaking a leg in the dark or running himself off a ridge was something she could not stand still for. The storm was not letting up. She had gone perhaps half a mile from the barn, following the sound of hoofbeats she could occasionally hear between the thunder, when her lantern went out in a gust of wind that hit her like a wall. She shook the lantern, tried to relight it with the matches she carried, but the wind was too strong and her hands were too cold, and after 3 attempts she gave up and stood in the absolute darkness of a Wyoming night in the middle of a thunderstorm, with the tree line somewhere ahead of her and the ranch somewhere behind her, and no clear sense of exactly how far she had come or in which direction the horse had gone. She was not afraid of the dark, not as a rule, but this particular dark was something else. The lightning, when it came, lit up the landscape in white flashes that were more disorienting than helpful, leaving her eyes struggling to adjust each time the blackness rushed back in. The rain had started now, cold and sharp, driving almost horizontal in the wind, and her coat was soaked through within minutes. "Copper," she called, though she knew it was futile. "Copper, come here, boy." The wind took her voice and threw it sideways, and the only answer was another crash of thunder rolling across the foothills. She pressed forward, reasoning that the horse would likely seek shelter at the tree line if he could not find his way back to the barn, and that her best chance of catching him was to get to the trees and wait out the worst of the storm. The ground was rough here, uneven with rocks and the occasional scrub brush that caught at her legs, and she moved carefully, placing each foot deliberately, holding her useless lantern in one hand and the lead rope in the other. She had just reached what she thought was the edge of the tree line, able to smell the pine and feel the slight reduction in the driving rain, when the lightning flashed again, and she saw something large moving between the trees, 20 yards ahead of her, and she could not tell if it was copper or something else entirely. She stepped forward and her boot caught the edge of a root she had not seen, and she went down hard on one knee with a sharp grunt of pain, catching herself on her hands in the wet pine needles, the lead rope skidding away from her into the dark. She was on her hands and knees in the mud in the dark in the middle of a Wyoming thunderstorm when she heard a voice that was not the wind. "Easy there." Not to her, to the horse. The voice was low and unhurried, carrying the kind of calm that was not performed but simply there, the way a deep river was calm on its surface even when the current ran powerful underneath. She pushed herself up to her feet, her knee aching, and another flash of lightning lit the scene ahead of her in brilliant white. A man. A very large man, with the kind of broad shoulders and chest that made him look like he had been built for the landscape rather than merely placed in it. He was standing with his hand extended toward a dark shape that was absolutely copper, and the horse, who usually shied from strangers, had his ears flicking forward with cautious interest rather than terror. The darkness crashed back down, and she heard the man make a low, rhythmic sound, almost like a hum speaking words she could not quite make out over the rain. Then another flash, and she saw he had his hand on Copper's nose, and the horse's head was dropping, the tension going out of his neck the way it only did when he was genuinely calming down. "That is my horse," Dorothy said, louder than she intended because the wind required it. There was a pause. "I figured as much," the man said. "You want to come get him, or should I bring him to you?" She could not see him well enough in the dark to read his expression, but there was nothing threatening in the voice, no sharpness or mockery. She moved forward, her hands out, finding Copper's neck by feel and patting it with genuine relief, while she let her eyes adjust to the small degrees of visibility the storm allowed. "He does not like lightning," she said, which felt like an absurd thing to say to a stranger in the dark but was also simply true. "Most horses do not," the man said. "There is a hollow in the rock about 50 yards north, dry more or less. You would do well to get out of this rain." She could see him better now as her eyes found what little light there was, a broad silhouette against the slightly lighter dark of the open sky visible through the trees. He was taller than her father, who was himself not a small man, and wider through the chest and arms. He wore a long coat of some kind, oilskin from the look of it, and his hair was dark and damp and longer than most men she knew, touching his collar and curling slightly at the ends from the rain. "Who are you?" she asked, because it seemed like the correct thing to establish. "Daniel Hale," he said. "I have a camp up in the foothills. I was coming down to see if anyone at the ranch needed help when the storm got bad. I saw your light go out." She processed this. A mountain man, then, someone who lived up in the higher country and came down to the ranching communities for trade or supplies or work. She had heard there were several who worked the territory around Laramie, men who trapped and hunted and lived by the rhythms of the land rather than the calendar of civilization, and who were often enough good neighbors to the ranching families when trouble came, because they knew the land in ways that those who farmed it could not always match. "Dorothy Turner," she said. "The ranch is mine and my father's, Turner Ranch." "I know it," he said simply. "Your father is a fair man. He bought a deer from me last winter." This surprised her somehow, the idea that her father knew this man and she had not known about it. But Elias Turner dealt with many people, and she could not keep track of all of them. "The hollow," she said, making a decision. "Show me." He led them through the trees with a sureness that told her he knew this particular piece of land well, one hand occasionally reaching back to move a branch out of her path without making a show of it, just quietly clearing the way. Copper followed docilely, his trust in the large man apparently already established in those few minutes of gentle handling, which told Dorothy something she filed away without examining yet. The hollow was exactly as described, a natural overhang of granite that created a space perhaps 12 feet deep and 8 feet wide, enough for 2 people, and a horse if they arranged themselves without ceremony. The ground inside was dry, or dry enough, and the rock cut the wind entirely so that the sound of the storm became something more manageable and distant. Daniel Hale pulled a match from somewhere inside his coat and produced a small tin lantern from a pack he had left propped against the rock wall. The light that came up was warm and steady, and Dorothy got her first real look at the man who had caught her horse. He was perhaps 30, or close to it, with a face that was not conventionally handsome in the polished way of town men, but was striking in the way of things that have been shaped by exposure to the elements into something more essential. His jaw was strong and square, shadowed with several days of dark beard, and his eyes, when the lantern light hit them, were a dark greenish-gray, the color of deep forest water. His shoulders were massive, the kind of muscular breadth that came from years of physical labor in wild country, chopping wood, hauling game, building and breaking camp in all weathers. His forearms, visible where his coat was pushed back at the wrist, were corded with muscle, and his hands were large and scarred in the practical way of a man who worked with them constantly. Dorothy was not in the habit of cataloging men's appearances, but she noticed all of this in the particular way you notice things that are simply there and demanding to be noticed, the way you notice a mountain or a storm. She sat down on a dry, flat rock and pulled Copper's lead rope around a natural notch in the stone so he could not wander. The gelding was calm now, blinking slowly in the lantern light, already half asleep on his feet. "Thank you," she said, meaning it. "If you had not been here, I might have been hunting him until dawn." "Or longer," Daniel said, without any particular judgment in it, just an honest assessment. He pulled a piece of cloth from his pack and offered it to her without comment, and she used it to wipe the rain from her face and wring some of the water from the end of her braid. "You said you were coming down to check on the ranch," she said. "Why?" He settled himself on the ground across from her, not leaning against the wall in a casual way but sitting with his back straight and easy, the way men who spent time in wilderness often sat, comfortable in themselves without requiring support. "I came down through the high pass 3 days ago, seen signs of trouble up near the north ridge of your property where it backs onto Turner Creek. Something has been working the cattle at night." Dorothy sat up straighter. "What kind of something?" "Mountain lion, I believe," he said. "Big one. I found tracks and what was left of a calf, though the carcass was old, maybe 2 weeks. I was going to tell your father." This was useful and serious information, and she took it in with the part of her mind that was always running ranch business. She and Elias had lost 2 calves in the past month and attributed the losses to other causes, a sickness in one case and rocky terrain in the other. But if there was a lion working the North Ridge, that changed everything. "My father will want to hear that," she said. "He is at the house. Are you willing to come up in the morning?" "That was my intention," Daniel said. The storm continued outside, rolling and fierce, the lightning reflecting off the wet rock outside the hollow and creating moments of brilliance that made the lantern light seem very warm by comparison. Dorothy realized she was cold, properly cold now that the adrenaline of chasing the horse was leaving her, and she pulled her wet coat tighter around herself without much hope. "Here," Daniel said, and before she could object or think about whether to object, he had shrugged out of his oilskin coat and held it out to her. Underneath he wore a heavy flannel shirt over what appeared to be a wool undershirt, and the layers looked warm enough for him, though she was still surprised by the gesture. She hesitated for only a second, because she was genuinely cold, and then took the coat and pulled it around her shoulders. It was enormous, swallowing her, and it smelled of wood smoke and pine and something else she did not have a name for, something that was simply the smell of a man who lived outdoors in wild places. "Thank you," she said again. I seem to be saying that to you a great deal tonight. You can stop if it bothers you, he said, and there was something very dry in the delivery that made her lips press together against a smile she had not been expecting to feel. They were quiet for a time, the storm speaking for them, and Dorothy found that the silence was not uncomfortable in the way silences often were with people she did not know well. He did not seem to need to fill it, and after a while she did not either. "How long have you been up in the mountains?" she asked eventually. He considered the question as if it deserved genuine thought. 7 years, more or less, in this territory. Came west from Missouri before that. What made you come west? Another pause, and she had the sense that he was deciding how much to give. The war did not leave much behind me, he said finally. I was young. The West seemed like somewhere a man could build something that was only about what he was willing to do and not about what had already happened. She understood this more than she would have expected. The war between the states had taken her father's younger brother, and she had grown up with the shadow of that loss on Elias Turner without ever fully understanding what it meant to have been part of it. Daniel Hale would have been perhaps 8 or 9 when the war ended in 1865, old enough to have seen what it did to the men around him. Has it been, she asked, what you thought? He looked at her directly for the first time since they had settled in the hollow, and the lantern light made something of his eyes she had not seen in the general assessment of his face before, something thoughtful and perhaps lonely and also entirely without self-pity. Mostly, he said, it is honest country. It does not pretend to be anything it is not. No, she agreed. Wyoming does not pretend. They talked through the storm, which was more than she expected and perhaps more than either of them expected. She told him about the ranch, about the cattle and the horses and the foaling season, and the ongoing battle with the fencing on the north side that kept getting damaged by elk in the rut. He told her about the mountains in a way that made them sound not inhospitable but simply precise, a place where cause and effect were very clear, and where you earned each day by being equal to it. He trapped beaver and mink, hunted elk and deer, traded furs in Laramie twice a year, and lived in a cabin he had built himself on a south-facing slope at about 8,000 feet. "Do you never want more company?" she asked, and then immediately felt the question was too personal. But he did not seem to find it intrusive. "I come down to Laramie when I need to," he said. "The solitude suits me well enough, but," he added and stopped. She waited. "It is not that I prefer loneliness," he said carefully. "It is more that I had not found a reason to prefer otherwise." She did not know what to do with that sentence, so she did not do anything with it, and the storm filled the space between them again. The rain began to ease somewhere around midnight. Dorothy, who had dozed briefly with her back against the rock and the enormous borrowed coat around her shoulders, woke to find the thunder far to the east, and the immediate sounds replaced by the steady drip of water from the granite overhang and the deep, satisfied breathing of Copper, who was thoroughly asleep. Daniel Hale was awake, adding a small knot of pine to a tiny fire he had built near the hollow entrance, just large enough to give heat without creating smoke that would fill the space. She watched him for a moment before she said anything, the way you sometimes watch people when they do not know you are watching, to see what they are like when they are not performing for an audience. He was tending the fire with exact, unhurried attention, breaking a stick precisely and setting it in place, and there was a quality to his movements she could only describe as economy, nothing wasted, nothing performative, everything done at exactly the right speed. "The storm is passing," she said. He glanced over at her. "Yes, another hour, maybe 2, and the ground will be stable enough to go back." "I should not stay that long," she said, though she had not moved yet. "My father will worry if he wakes and I am gone." He did not come looking. There was no criticism in this, just information-seeking. "He has been ill," she said, and heard the flatness in her own voice that meant she was keeping emotion out of something she would rather not have to keep emotion out of. "His heart. The doctor in Laramie says he needs to rest. He sleeps heavily now with the medicine." She paused. "I did not want to wake him for a loose horse." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "How long has he been ill?" "Since spring," she said. He is better than he was, but—" She did not finish the sentence, and he did not press her to, and she was grateful for that too. The truth of it was that Elias Turner at 61 was not the man he had been at 50, and the heart troubles had taken something from him that might not come back, and the ranch increasingly ran on Dorothy's judgment and energy more than his, and this was a truth she had not said out loud to anyone because saying it felt disloyal. "He is lucky to have you," Daniel said simply. She looked at him. He was not looking at her, he was looking at the fire, but she could see from his profile that he meant it without ornamentation. "You do not know me well enough to say that," she said. "I know you chased a horse into a Wyoming thunderstorm in the dark rather than let it come to harm," he said. "That tells me something." She did not have an answer for that, and the fire crackled between them, and the night outside the hollow was beginning to release from solid black to something slightly less absolute, the suggestion of depth returning to the sky that meant the clouds were breaking. She stood up eventually, stretched the stiffness from her back, and gently took the oilskin coat from her shoulders and held it out to him. He stood to take it, and she realized again how large he was, how much he filled the space of the hollow, though he took care to take up only exactly as much space as he needed, which was not the same thing as the space he could have demanded. "I can find my way back from here," she said. "I will walk you," he said. "You do not need to," she said. "I know I do not," he said. He put the lantern in her hand, banked the small fire, and led Copper out into the wet dark ahead of her without waiting for her to argue further. She followed because there was nothing to argue about, really. It was a kind gesture from a man who seemed to specialize in quiet, practical kindness. He walked her back to the barn, which took 20 minutes at a steady pace through the dripping trees and the wet grass of the open meadow. The storm had left the air clean and cold and very clear, and by the time they reached the barn fence the sky was beginning to show the first gray suggestion of dawn at its eastern edge, painting the horizon in shades of iron and silver. She brought Copper inside and checked him over in the lantern light, found him none the worse for his adventure, gave him grain and water and checked his shoes. Daniel waited outside the barn door without coming in, giving her space to do what she needed without crowding her. When she came out, he was standing in the barnyard looking at the sky with his hands at his sides, and she noticed that even standing still he looked like someone who could at any moment do something requiring significant physical effort and do it well. "Come up in the morning," she said, "for coffee before you speak with my father about the lion. You will have earned it." He looked at her. In the gray pre-dawn light, she could see his face more clearly than she had been able to at any point in the night, and she thought again that he was not a handsome man in the usual way, but that there was something in his face that was better than handsome, something reliable and real. "I will be here at 7, he said. She went inside, dried herself, and slept for 3 hours, and when she woke up and walked downstairs she realized she was looking forward to 7 o'clock in a way she could not entirely account for. He was there at 7 exactly, as he had said he would be, and she had coffee on the stove and bacon in the pan and biscuits in the oven, and she let him in through the kitchen door with less ceremony than she might have expected to feel about letting a stranger into her kitchen, except that he did not feel like a stranger, which was a thing she noted and then set aside to examine later. He sat at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and drank his coffee black and ate everything she put in front of him with quiet, steady appreciation, and when she sat down across from him with her own cup, he looked around the kitchen with the particular look of a man who had not been in a proper kitchen in some time. "It is a good house," he said. "My father built it," she said. "Most of it. Good timber work. He is proud of it." She told him her father was awake and would be down shortly, and that she had told Elias last night about the lion when she had gone in to check on him, and that he would want to discuss a plan for dealing with it. Daniel nodded and turned his coffee cup in his large hands and seemed comfortable with waiting, which matched everything else about him. Elias Turner came downstairs at 7:30, moving more slowly than he once had, a barrel-chested man who had shrunk slightly at the shoulders with illness but still carried himself with the remnant authority of the ranch he had built. He shook Daniel's hand with genuine warmth and sat down heavily in the chair at the head of the table and accepted the coffee Dorothy poured him. "Hale," Elias said, "good man to have near when trouble comes." "I try to earn my keep in the territory," Daniel said. They talked about the lion for an hour, planning systematically. Daniel described the track and pattern he had observed, and Elias confirmed the calf losses, and together they mapped out a strategy that involved checking the North Ridge fencing, reinforcing the cattle pen on that side, and setting up observation points from which the lion could be watched, and if it proved necessary, driven off or shot. Daniel offered to spend several nights on watch in the high ground where he had seen the tracks, and Elias accepted without false pride, because he was a practical man and he knew when help was needed. Dorothy sat at the table through this conversation and contributed to it, because she knew the North Ridge better than her father did anymore, having ridden it regularly for the past 6 months, and her observations about where the cattle tended to shelter at night were useful. Neither man talked over her or around her, which she appreciated, though she had half expected Daniel Hale to be the sort of man who would defer to Elias and ignore her. He did not. He addressed his comments and questions to whoever had the relevant information, regardless of the fact that one of them was a woman of 23, and this was, she thought, another thing to file away. He left after breakfast, saying he would be back the following afternoon to set up on the North Ridge, and Elias watched him go from the porch with an expression Dorothy could not entirely read. "Good man," Elias said again when Daniel's figure had disappeared toward the tree line. "Honest as the day is long. Helped me pull a steer out of Turner Creek 2 years ago, never asked for anything in return." "He mentioned buying a deer from you last winter," Dorothy said. "Sold it fair," Elias said. He would not take charity, insisted on a fair trade. He was quiet for a moment, then said, without looking at her, "You came in very late last night." "Copper got loose in the storm," she said. "I caught him. It took a while." Elias Turner was not a foolish man, and she suspected he knew there was more to that account than she was giving, but he did not push, and she did not offer more, and they went on about the day's business as if the previous night had been perfectly ordinary. Daniel came back the following afternoon, and the afternoon after that, and somewhere in the middle of the second week of his coming, and going to set the lion watches and check the North Ridge fencing and consult with Dorothy and her father about the cattle movements. The visits began to feel like something that had always been happening and would continue to happen, which was itself a thing Dorothy noticed and could not quite explain. He spent the evenings in the barn sometimes, repairing equipment or tending to the horses, because his hands were always better occupied than idle, and Dorothy found reasons to be in the barn at the same times, which she recognized was not entirely coincidental. They talked about everything and nothing, in the way people talk when they are comfortable with each other, moving from practical matters to things further afield, the books they had each read, the shape of the land, what they thought about a dozen different questions that came up naturally in the course of working. She learned that he had read more than she expected. A man who lived alone had time for reading when the season allowed, and that he had opinions about what he read that were direct and thought through. She learned that he had a dry humor that appeared without warning in the middle of a completely serious conversation and always surprised her into laughing. She learned that he had a particular relationship with silence that was different from the silences of men who were uncomfortable or evasive. It was the silence of someone who had spent a great deal of time alone in the wilderness and had made peace with his own company. She also learned, in the way you learn things about people when you work alongside them, that Daniel Hale was remarkably good at noticing things. He noticed when a fence post was beginning to lean before it needed to be fixed, and he noticed when the gray mare was favoring her left foreleg before Dorothy herself had seen it. and he noticed when Dorothy was carrying something difficult and did not say so. Though what he did with this last observation was not to ask about it directly but simply to be a steadier presence, which was, she found, often more useful. He was there on the Tuesday morning, 3 weeks into his visits, when Dorothy came into the barn to find the gray mare down and struggling, and she had misread the signs of her labor progress, and the foal was coming wrong. She called for Daniel without thinking, not because she could not handle it, but because 4 hands were better than 2 in a difficult foaling, and he came from the yard at a run that covered the distance in seconds despite the ground being uneven. What happened next was not romantic in any conventional sense. It was an hour of hard, focused work, both of them with their sleeves rolled to the elbow, moving together in the close space of the foaling stall with the particular coordination of people who are instinctively calibrated to each other. And when the foal finally came, a bay colt with enormous ears and improbably long legs, and Dorothy sat back on her heels laughing with relief while the colt shook his head and the mare lifted hers, Daniel Hale was sitting in the straw beside her and laughing too. The first time she had heard him really laugh, and it was a sound that was warmer and larger than she had expected, and that did something to the inside of her chest she did not know what to do about. He had straw in his hair and something she preferred not to identify on his forearm, and he looked completely untroubled by either of these things, watching the colt try to organize his legs with the steady, pleased expression of someone who had seen a good thing happen and was glad to have been there. "He is a good-looking colt," Daniel said. "He is a disaster," Dorothy said, watching the colt's improbable attempts at standing. "He has too many legs for any one creature." "He will sort it out," Daniel said, and looked at her sideways with a slight lifting at the corner of his mouth that she was beginning to recognize as his version of a full smile. She looked away because looking at him when he did that was becoming somewhat overwhelming, and she did not entirely understand why. The lion made its presence known that same week, taking a yearling heifer from the north pasture on a Thursday night. Daniel found the remains on Friday morning and tracked the lion for 2 days through the high country before he came to the conclusion that it was moving east, away from the ranch's primary grazing land, and that persistent presence along the ridgeline had persuaded it to widen its range. He came down on Sunday evening to tell her father, and Elias declared it a satisfactory resolution, shook his hand, and offered him a week's wages for his time. Daniel refused the wages, as Elias had perhaps known he would, but he accepted the invitation to supper, which Elias perhaps also knew he would accept, because Dorothy had made a pot of elk stew that had been simmering since noon, and the smell of it was making the whole house impossibly welcoming. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours after supper, the 3 of them, with the oil lamp burning warm and the wind outside suggesting winter was not far off, and talked the way people talk when they are genuinely at ease with each other. Elias brought out a bottle of whiskey he kept for occasions worth marking, and they had a glass each, and Dorothy sat across from Daniel and watched her father talk to him, and saw that Elias liked this man, genuinely liked him, not in the way he was polite to people who came to do business, but in the way he was comfortable with people whose company he actually wanted. She understood the distinction very well because she felt it herself, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to pretend she was not feeling it. He said good night at 9, pulling his coat on in the doorway, and Elias had already gone back inside, and Dorothy walked him to the porch railing because it seemed like the right thing to do. The night was cold and bright with stars, the autumn air carrying the particular clean bite that preceded the first serious frost. "You will come back," she said, and heard that the question had slightly more weight to it than she had intended. He looked at her. The starlight did not provide much detail, but she could feel the quality of his attention in the way she had come to recognize it, the particular focused quality of a man who was actually listening. "Yes," he said, "I will come back." He walked off into the dark, and she stood on the porch for longer than was sensible given the cold, and when she went inside, her father was standing at the base of the stairs with an expression she knew very well, because it was the expression he wore when he was about to say something straightforward about an uncomfortable truth. "That is a good man, Dorothy," Elias said. "You have said so," she replied. "I am saying it again." He looked at her steadily. "He is a good man, and he is not blind, and neither are you." She said good night and went upstairs and lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, and thought about Daniel Hale's gray-green eyes in the lantern light of a granite hollow during a Wyoming thunderstorm, and admitted to herself, with all the honesty that Wyoming country demanded, that something was happening that she had not expected and could not stop. He came back 2 days later with a brace of pheasants he had taken in the high meadow, which was not strictly necessary, but gave him a reason to come that had nothing to do with the mountain lion, and Dorothy took the pheasants with a straight face and invited him for lunch, and he accepted with his own straight face, and her father watched this exchange from his chair by the window with an expression of complete and deliberate innocence. They walked the fence line in the afternoon, ostensibly to check the repairs Daniel had made to the north section, but actually because it gave them 3 miles of open country and 2 hours to fill however they chose to fill them. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone yellow gold, and the grass was the dry brown of deep autumn, and the sky was that particular Wyoming blue that was too vivid to be entirely believed. "What do you do when winter comes?" she asked him. "In the cabin." "Hunt when I can," he said. "Trap, keep the wood up, read." He glanced at her. "Think." "What do you think about?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he was not going to answer, and then he said, "Whatever is worth thinking about." "This fall I have had more to think about than usual." She was looking ahead at the fence line, and she kept looking ahead. Such as what a man does when his life has been one thing for a long time, and then he meets someone who makes him think it might want to be another thing. He said this without drama, in the same even tone he used for everything, but the words were entirely unambiguous. Dorothy stopped walking. He stopped beside her. They were standing at the edge of the creek, the water running low and cold and chattering over the stones, the yellow cottonwood leaves drifting down around them in the still air. She turned and looked at him, and found he was already looking at her, and his expression was the most she had seen on his face at any one time, something that was not uncertainty exactly, but was the look of a man who has committed to a direction and is waiting to see what the terrain will give him. "Daniel," she said, and was surprised by how easy it was to say his name. "I know it has not been long," he said. "I know I am not a man with a great deal to offer by some measures. I do not have a town life or a steady wage. What I have is the land I know and whatever I am. But I find that I would very much like to spend more time in your company, Miss Turner, if you would permit it." It was, she thought, the most direct and somehow most respectful way anyone had ever expressed something like that to her, because he was not promising her anything he was not certain he could deliver, and he was not pretending to be something he was not, and those two things together meant more to her than any amount of fine words could have. "I would permit it," she said, "and my name is Dorothy." Something shifted in his face, small but definite, a kind of settling, like a thing that had been braced against uncertainty could rest now. "Dorothy," he said. They walked back to the ranch in the afternoon light with the creek talking beside them, and neither of them said anything more about it, because it had been said, and saying it more would have been less. That evening at supper, Elias looked between them with the expression of a man whose observations have been confirmed, and said nothing, which was itself a form of everything. The weeks that followed were the best Dorothy could remember in a long time, which surprised her because nothing about them was dramatic or extraordinary by any objective measure. He came down from the mountain 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes to work alongside the ranch hands on whatever needed doing, sometimes just to talk with her and her father in the evenings. He was easy to have around in the way of people who do not create unnecessary complications, who do what they say they will do, and do not say things they do not mean. He helped her father with a drainage problem in the south pasture that had been bothering Elias for 2 seasons, doing the digging work himself over 3 days because the ground was hard, swinging a pickaxe in the cold October sun with the steady power of a man who was simply equal to whatever physical task was in front of him. She brought him water and watched him work sometimes from the fence, and he would straighten up and take the water from her and drink it and look at her and say something dry and brief that made her laugh, and then go back to work without any of the self-consciousness that might have made it awkward. One afternoon in early November, with the sky carrying the pewter color of incoming serious weather, she rode up to meet him on the ridge where he had been checking his trap line, something she had not done before, going to him rather than waiting for him to come down. He saw her coming from a distance, recognizable to him on copper even at that range, and he raised a hand in greeting and waited for her to reach him. She pulled Copper up beside his big gray mule and looked out at the view from the ridge, which was enormous and silent, and everything that Wyoming was at its most itself, the range rolling out below in brown and gold, and the distant mountains carrying their first serious snow on the high peaks. "I wanted to see where you lived," she said. "From this side." He looked at her for a moment. "Come up tomorrow," he said. "I will show you the cabin." She came up the next morning, riding Copper at a steady walk through the aspen and pine, following the trail he had described precisely, and arrived at a clearing on a south-facing slope to find a cabin that was small but built with the same economy and exactness that characterized everything he did. It was made of pine logs, squared and fitted together without gaps, with a real chimney and a plank door and 2 small windows that caught the southern light. There was a woodpile beside the cabin that was enormous, enough for a full winter, stacked with military precision, and a small lean-to shed that housed his mule and his equipment. He met her at the clearing's edge and helped her down from Copper without making it a show, just a practical hand offered, though she did not strictly need it. He showed her the cabin inside, which was what she might have expected. Simple furniture he had made himself, a bunk with good wool blankets, a small iron stove, shelves of supplies and traps and tools, and a row of books along one wall that was larger than she had anticipated. She went to the books and read the spines. Scott Cooper Thoreau, a worn Bible, 2 books on natural history, a battered copy of Dickens. "I did not bring much west with me," he said from behind her, "but I brought those." She took down the Thoreau, which she had read, and they talked about it standing in the small bright space of the cabin with the fire and the stove making it warm. And she realized this was a version of Daniel Hale she had not quite seen before, not the man of the outdoor spaces and the practical work, but the man who lived with himself in the winters and had thoughts about things beyond the immediate physical world. And she found she liked this version just as much as all the other versions she had been discovering. He made coffee on the stove and they sat outside on the cut log bench by the cabin door, in coats, in the thin November sun, with the view of the valley below them spread out like something painted, and the conversation moved through 6 things in the way their conversations had come to move, easily and without agenda. At some point, without a particular reason she could have named, she put her hand over his where it rested on the log bench between them, just resting her hand on top of his large, scarred hand, and he turned his hand over and held hers with a steadiness that felt like a promise. And they sat like that looking at the valley for a while, and the feeling in her chest was the particular feeling of something that has arrived and is exactly right and cannot be rushed or made larger than it already is. He walked with her to where Copper was tied when she needed to go back. "Dorothy," he said, and she turned, and he was very close and very present, and his gray-green eyes were serious in the way they were when he meant something. "Yes," she said, before he had said anything else, because she knew the shape of what he was about to say. He put his hand against her face with extraordinary gentleness, which was always the surprise of him, how gentle those large hands could be, and he kissed her once carefully as if it were something he wanted to do properly. She kissed him back with the same careful intention, and when they stepped apart the day looked exactly the same as it had before and also completely different. She rode home through the November aspens with her heart doing something complicated and warm in her chest, and when she got back and unsaddled Copper and went inside, she sat down at the kitchen table and looked at her hands for a long moment, and thought about the fact that she had not been looking for this and that it had found her anyway, in a thunderstorm in the dark, in the shape of a man catching a loose horse and saying easy, there, in a voice that was calm all the way down. Elias looked at her face when she came to supper and smiled at his plate and said nothing, and she loved him for that. The question of what came next was not one that could wait indefinitely, and both she and Daniel understood this without having to say it directly. She could not leave the ranch, not while her father's health was uncertain and the operation depended on her management. He could not precisely live in the ranch house without a formal change in the situation between them that would satisfy the conventions of 1878, which had some requirements even in the more loosely formal world of Wyoming frontier life. He came to speak with Elias Turner on a Friday afternoon in mid-November, which Elias had clearly been expecting from the way he put on his better vest and sat up straight in his chair when Daniel knocked. Dorothy made herself scarce to the kitchen, though the kitchen was close enough to the sitting room that she could hear most of what was said, and she stood at the counter with her hands around a coffee cup and listened to Daniel Hale ask her father for permission to court her properly with the intention of marriage, using plain and direct language that had no ornamentation but was entirely clear about what he meant and what he was prepared to offer. He told Elias he had money saved from 7 years of trapping and trading, enough to build on the Turner property if Elias was willing to extend the land, or to contribute to the ranch itself as a working partner. He told him he intended to stay, that he was not a man who made promises lightly or abandoned them. He told him that he had a great deal of respect for Dorothy Turner and that this would not change. Elias let him finish and then said, "Daniel, you have my blessing, and I believe you know you have Dorothy's, but you ought to ask her yourself." There was a pause, and then Elias said more quietly, "She is the best thing I ever made, that girl. You understand what I am trusting you with?" "Yes, sir," Daniel said. "I understand exactly." Dorothy was standing very still in the kitchen with her hand over her mouth, and the coffee cup was forgotten, and the feeling in her chest was almost too large to hold. He came to the kitchen door. She turned around. He was holding his hat in his hands, and his expression was serious and entirely open, all the usual reserve translated into something very direct and clear. "You heard most of that," he said, because he knew her. "Most of it," she admitted. He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her, and she looked up at him because he was very tall and she was aware of every inch of the distance between them. "Dorothy Turner," he said, "I am not a man who says things he does not mean. I love you. I have been trying to work out a way to say that that is worthy of it, and I cannot find one, so I will just say it plainly. I would like to marry you. I would like to build a life with you. I would like to be the man who stands beside you in whatever this land throws at both of us. If that is something you want too, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you do not regret saying yes." She looked at him for a long moment, at his serious face and his gray-green eyes and his enormous, gentle hands holding his hat, and she thought about the night in the thunderstorm and the granite hollow and the lantern light and everything that had come after. "Daniel," she said, "I stopped needing to think about whether I wanted it approximately 3 weeks ago. Yes." He put the hat down on the table and took both her hands in his and held them, and then he pulled her forward and held her properly, his arms around her, and she put her cheek against his chest and felt the warmth of him and the solidity of him, and the steadiness that she had been feeling all these weeks from a careful distance, and that was even more itself when there was no distance left. "Yes," she said again, against his chest, because it was worth saying twice. They were married in Laramie in December, in the small Lutheran church on the main street, with Elias Turner standing at his daughter's side, and a handful of ranch hands and townspeople, and 2 of Daniel's trading acquaintances from Laramie in attendance. The minister was a brisk, kind man who married them in 20 minutes with a thoroughness that covered everything important. And when Daniel put the ring on Dorothy's finger, plain gold, which he had picked out with the same care and economy he brought to everything, she felt the weight of it as something that was entirely right. They had a supper at the hotel afterward, courtesy of Elias, who had insisted on providing it, and the wedding night was spent at the hotel before they drove back to the ranch the next morning in the wagon, through an inch of new snow that made the Wyoming landscape something almost mythological in its beauty. Elias was at the house when they arrived back, and he had kept the fire going, and there was coffee on the stove, and the house felt different to Dorothy than it had in years, fuller somehow, which she understood was not about the physical space but about who was in it. She had wondered, privately, whether Daniel would find the ranch life too confining after 7 years of mountain freedom, whether the rhythms of working land in cooperation with other people would chafe against his long habit of solitude. What she found instead, over the winter and into the spring, was that he adapted with the same practical intelligence he brought to everything, taking up the ranch work as a fully committed partner, not merely someone helping out, but someone who had made a decision and was living it completely. He was not soft about it. He had opinions about how things should be done, and he said so, clearly and without rancor, and sometimes Dorothy agreed with him, and sometimes she did not, and they learned to argue about ranch decisions the way practical people do, by presenting their positions plainly, and then deciding based on what was actually best rather than whose pride was at stake. He respected her knowledge of the land and the operation. She respected his knowledge of the wilderness that surrounded and interacted with it. Between the 2 of them and Elias' experience, the Turner Ranch was better managed than it had been in years. He built them a house. Not immediately, because the winter was not the time for it, but in the spring of 1879 he began it, taking timber from the upper property with Elias' approval and working on it every evening and on the days when ranch business allowed, laying the foundation himself, raising the walls with help from the ranch hands, fitting the joinery with the quiet precision that was signature to everything he made. Dorothy helped where she could and had opinions about the interior that he incorporated without complaint, and by July they had a house 40 yards from Elias' original structure, 2 rooms initially with the understanding that more would be added as needed. As needed arrived sooner than either of them had planned, or perhaps exactly as quickly as they had secretly hoped. By August of 1879, Dorothy knew she was expecting a child. She told Daniel on a summer evening when the hay was in, and the sky was the impossible deep blue of Wyoming midsummer, sitting on the porch of their new house with the first real comfort of furniture she had chosen for their own space. He was very still for a moment, and then he turned and looked at her with something in his face that she had not seen before, something completely unguarded, something that was joy without any of the reserve that usually filtered his expressions. "Are you certain?" he said. "I am certain," she said. He reached over and took her hand and held it, and they sat on the porch in the long summer evening while the light faded over the mountains, and the feeling between them was very large and very quiet and very good. She told Elias the next morning. He sat at his kitchen table and cried briefly, with a directness about it that she had rarely seen from him, and then composed himself and said, "Your mother would be so glad," and she had to take a moment herself before she could answer. The winter of 1879 going into 1880 was hard in the way Wyoming winters often were. Heavy snow and weeks of bitter cold that kept everyone close to the buildings and the fires. But the house Daniel had built was warm and tight, and they were together in it. And Dorothy's pregnancy was uncomplicated, if physically demanding, because she was not a woman who could easily be still for long. Daniel was a revelation in these months. He had always been attentive and practical in his care for the people and things around him, but in the particular context of his pregnant wife in a hard Wyoming winter, he achieved a level of steady, quiet devotion that she found simultaneously touching and occasionally exasperating, because he noticed every time she was tired before she acknowledged it herself, and he had a way of having already done whatever needed doing before she had time to think about doing it. "I am capable of carrying a bucket of water," she told him one February morning, when she found he had already filled the house water supply before she came downstairs. "I know you are," he said. "I enjoy doing it." She looked at him, and he looked at her with the slight corner-of-the-mouth expression that meant he was amused, and she gave up arguing about it because there was nothing to argue about that was actually an argument. Their son was born in March of 1880, delivered by the same woman who had delivered Dorothy herself, a practical and competent midwife named Mrs. Aldrich, who drove out from Laramie through 8 inches of late snow because that was her profession, and she took it seriously. Daniel was in the house throughout, because Dorothy had told him she wanted him there and he had not required any persuading, and when it was over and Mrs. Aldrich put the baby in his arms, Daniel Hale stood in the lamplight of their bedroom looking at his son with the expression of a man who has been handed something he did not know he was building his life toward until it arrived. The baby was red-faced and had an impressive amount of dark hair and enormous lungs, which he demonstrated immediately and at length. "He is healthy," Dorothy said, from the bed, tired beyond what she had expected but fundamentally well. "He sounds like a mountain storm." "He does," Daniel said, sitting on the edge of the bed beside her so she could see the baby too. "What do you want to call him?" They had argued about names pleasantly for months without reaching a conclusion, and she had a name in mind that she had not shared yet, waiting for this exact moment. "Elias Daniel Hale," she said. He looked at her, and then at the baby, and then at her again, and said, "Your father will say it is too much honor." "My father will say it is exactly right," she said, which proved accurate. Elias Turner, brought in from the main house through the snow by one of the ranch hands at dawn, held his grandson for the first time sitting in the chair by the bedroom window with the March light coming in and the snow still falling outside, and said the name quietly to himself, and then said, "Yes, that is exactly right." The years that followed were the years Dorothy would look back on as the architecture of a life she had not known to wish for because she had not known it was possible. The ranch grew steadily under the combined management of herself and Daniel, and the gradually improving health of Elias, who had a period of genuine recovery in 1880 and 1881 that allowed him to be more active than the doctor had predicted, though he remained careful with himself and gave more of the heavy decision-making to Dorothy and Daniel. Daniel never fully abandoned the mountains. He still went up 2 or 3 times a year to trap and to be in the high country alone for a week or two, because it was part of who he was and she understood that, and she did not ask him to be something different from what he was. She would pack him food for the trip and stand at the gate watching him go with Copper's successor, a big bay gelding he had bought in Laramie, and he would always stop at the gate and look back at her in a way that said everything that needed to be said without a word, and she would nod, and he would go. He always came back different from these trips, quieter in a way that eventually became fuller, as if he had needed to go to the still place and refill something that the dailiness of ranch life emptied out. He would come back with good furs or a deer across the horse's back, and the smell of pine and high air and wood smoke that she had first known on the borrowed oilskin coat, and he would come through the gate and she would step out to meet him, and something in both of them would settle back into place. Their second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1882, whom they named Clara for Dorothy's mother. She had Daniel's gray-green eyes and Dorothy's dark hair and her grandfather's stubbornness, which became apparent very early and only increased. Elias was alive to see her born and spent the following 2 years in the particular fulfillment of a man who has grandchildren demanding his attention and has discovered a new reason to be present for every day. He died in the winter of 1884, Elias Turner, quietly and at peace, in his own bed in the house he had built with his own hands, with Dorothy beside him and Daniel in the doorway and both grandchildren asleep in the next room. He had had time to say what he wanted to say, which was not very much because he was not a man of many words, but which included telling Dorothy that he was proud of her in a way that settled something she had not known needed settling, and telling Daniel that he trusted him with the most important thing he had, which was the same thing he had said on the day he gave them his blessing. The ranch became fully theirs after that, registered in both names by Dorothy's insistence, which Daniel supported without question, because in 1884 this was less common than it should have been, and Dorothy felt it was important. They hired additional hands as the operation expanded, and Daniel added a proper horse trading component to the business, drawing on his knowledge of horses and his reputation in the territory as someone who could assess an animal honestly, which turned out to be its own substantial income. Little Elias grew up straddling two worlds the way children of two particular parents will, equally comfortable on horseback working cattle and tracking deer through the high timber with his father, who taught him the mountain skills with the same patient precision he brought to everything. Clara grew up fearless and opinionated, and spent her girlhood driving everyone around her completely mad with love and exasperation in roughly equal measure, and took to the horse trading side of things with a commercial instinct that nobody had anticipated. One evening in the summer of 1886, 8 years after a thunderstorm and a loose horse, and a stranger's voice in the dark saying, "Easy," there, Dorothy and Daniel sat on the porch of the house he had built and expanded 3 times by then, in the long Wyoming evening light, with the sounds of their children somewhere down by the creek and the cattle moving in the far pasture, and the mountains standing as they always stood, enormous and patient and permanent. She had her feet up on the porch railing and his hand was over hers on the arm of the chair, and neither of them had said anything for a pleasant while, which was still one of the best things about them, that the silences between them were never empty. "Daniel," she said, "I have been thinking." "About what?" She looked out at the mountains, at the particular light on the high peaks that made them look close enough to touch, which was a Wyoming illusion she had loved her whole life. "About that night," she said, "when Copper got loose." He was quiet for a moment, and she knew he was thinking about it too, the rain and the dark and the hollow in the rock and 2 strangers becoming something neither of them had planned. "I think about it," he said. "I have wondered sometimes what would have happened if the storm had not come," she said, "or if Copper had not gotten loose, whether you would have come down to the ranch about the lion and I would have met you some other way, or whether you would have just told my father about it and left and we would never have." He was quiet for a moment more, looking at the mountains with the steady attention he gave to everything that mattered. "I think," he said slowly, "that I would have found you, one way or another." He paused. "Or you would have found me. You were not a woman who was going to stay in the house and wait for things to happen." She laughed at that, a full, genuine laugh. "No, I was not." "So one way or another," he said, and his hand squeezed hers. She looked at him, at the face that she knew now in all its weathers and moods and expressions, the face she had watched age slightly these 8 years in the way of men who work outdoors, the gray beginning at his temples and the lines at the corners of his eyes that were partly sun, and partly the evidence of having learned to smile more freely than he once had. He was still the largest person she knew, still built like the mountains he loved, still carried himself with the economy and steadiness that had been the first thing she noticed about him, standing in the dark holding a runaway horse as if there was nothing to it. "One way or another," she agreed. The 3rd child had been born in 1885, a boy they called James, who at a year old was already proving to have his father's constitution and his mother's curiosity, which was a combination that kept everyone on their feet. Dorothy was 29 and Daniel was 37, and the ranch was the finest operation in the county, which people in Laramie said freely and with only occasional jealousy. And the house on the Turner property was a real house now, with 4 rooms and a proper parlor, and a vegetable garden that Dorothy tended with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. There were difficult things, because there always were. There was a dry summer in 1885 that threatened the grass and required selling cattle earlier than planned. There were disputes with neighboring ranchers over water rights from Turner Creek that Daniel handled with the blunt directness of a man who was comfortable in confrontation, that was honest, and deeply uncomfortable with anything that was not. There was a hard year for the horses in 1883 that cost them 3 animals to a sickness, and a financial tightness for most of that winter. There was the grief of losing Elias, which did not diminish so much as change shape, becoming part of the landscape of the days rather than a constant foreground. Through all of it, they were the same with each other, honest and direct and fundamentally unafraid of the difficulties, because the difficulties were simply what the life was, and the life was worth having. He was always the person she wanted to talk to when something was hard, not because he always had answers. He did not pretend to, but because he listened in the particular way that made thinking out loud actually useful, and because his judgment, when he offered it, was rooted in something she trusted absolutely. In the fall of 1886, with young Elias 6 and Clara 4 and James 1, Dorothy discovered she was expecting again. She told Daniel on the porch in the evening, and he received the news with the same quality of joy she had first seen on his face 6 years ago when she had told him about the first one, a little quieter because 3 children and a 4th was a substantial thing, but joy entirely. "That will be 4, she said, somewhat unnecessarily. "Yes," he said. "Are you worried?" He looked at her steadily. "About you," he said, "in the way I always am, not about the rest of it." She understood this distinction. "I am well," she said. "I am always well." "I know," he said. "I still worry." She put her head on his shoulder, which was a thing she did often, resting against the solid reality of him. "Daniel?" "Yes. I am very glad you were up on that ridge that night. I'm very glad about the storm and Copper getting loose and all of it." He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "So am I, more than I have words for." The 4th child was born in the spring of 1887, a girl with Dorothy's amber eyes and Daniel's dark hair, and a disposition that from the very beginning was the most serene and gentle of all 4 of them. They called her Margaret, and Daniel held her for a very long time the morning she arrived, standing by the window with the spring light coming in and the mountains visible in the distance. And his face was the face of a man who knows the full weight of what he has been given and is not taking a single gram of it for granted. The Laramie paper ran a small notice that spring about the Turner Hale Ranch, which was what people had taken to calling it, noting that it was one of the finest horse breeding and cattle operations in the territory, covering nearly 800 acres by then, with a reputation for fair dealing and good animals, and the kind of management that other ranchers came to study. The man named in the article alongside Dorothy was described as a former mountain man who had come down from the high country to build something worth building, which was accurate as far as it went, though it did not say anything about loose horses or thunderstorms or lantern light in a granite hollow, or the way 2 people can find the exact thing they needed without knowing they were looking for it. Dorothy read the article at the kitchen table and showed it to Daniel, who read it and said, "They misspelled Hale," and handed it back to her without further comment, which made her laugh until she had to put the paper down. On a morning in late September of that year, when the cottonwoods along the creek had gone the same yellow gold she remembered from that first autumn, Dorothy rode Copper's successor, a steady gray mare now, up to the ridge where Daniel had once watched the lion's tracks and where they had walked on one of their first real afternoons together, before the words between them had caught up to what was already happening. She went alone, which she still did when she needed the particular quality of thinking that only open country permitted. She sat on the mare at the ridge and looked at the valley below and the ranch below that, the buildings small and real and hers, and the mountains above her with the season's first snow on the high peaks. The air had that October quality of being very clean and very serious about its intentions. Below in the yard, she could see Daniel moving from the barn to the house, the familiar massive shape of him, the easy certainty of his stride, and the sight of him going about the daily work of their shared life hit her, with a wave of something so uncomplicated and complete that she had to simply sit with it for a moment. She had not been looking for any of this. She had been trying to catch a horse in the dark. She had been doing what was necessary, as she always did, and the extraordinary had arrived sideways, in the shape of a calm voice and large hands and gray-green eyes, in a thunderstorm that had not been convenient at all but had turned out to be, in every way that counted, the best storm of her life. She turned the mare and rode back down toward the ranch, toward the sound of her children and the smell of supper beginning on the stove and the life she was living fully and without reservation. And Daniel looked up from the yard when she came through the gate and raised a hand, and she raised hers back, and between them in that ordinary gesture was everything that needed to be said about what they were to each other and what they had built, and what they were going to keep building, year by year, in the honest and unforgiving and magnificent country that had given them to each other. She dismounted at the barn and he came to take the mare's reins, and she looked up at him in the autumn afternoon light with the mountains behind him and the yellow cottonwoods along the creek and the sounds of her children inside the house, and she thought, this is it. This is the thing. This is what all of it was for. Good ride, he said. Very good, she said. He led the mare inside, and she followed, and the September afternoon closed around the Turner Hale ranch in the Wyoming hills, solid and warm and complete, and in the barn the horses breathed their steady breath, and in the house the children made their ordinary beautiful noise, and the mountains stood above it all as they always had and always would, patient and permanent and vast, holding the whole wide world of it in their long sight.